My name is Dranath, and this is my Abstinence Authority Diary. I've spent most of my life in a refinement camp, but have never used violence against the occupiers of my ancestors' land. The ruling government took notice of me when I was 7 because of a conflict solution I whimsically wrote, which used their rhetoric and seemed to present their side in a light they liked. Of course, people thought I was a traitor even as a little boy, but the governing body of my family's historic land continued to take note of my upright behavior and how I excelled in school. When I turned 18, I was shocked when the oft-remorseless repressors offered me rights that are unheard of for most anyone in my community. Not only was I to become a citizen, I was offered a mortgage on a house, was made exempt of my student loans, and received a favorable tax incentive. At least that's what it seemed. The catch, or rather the hit, my reproductive area. I will explain the ideological interests of my oppressors later. What matters now is that I'm one of the first of their guinea pigs to complete an International Negotiations Committee approved experiment called the Continence Contingence to forever curb the reproductive patterns of young men like me and to effectively end production of my type. This corresponded with a catastrophe for my family. Although my colony was allotted a small piece of land in the 2138-46 Chromosome Act, the oppressors did not grant us this land, and instead we were forced out of it, and my parents lost their property and all of our possessions. Through the Continence Contingency, a few seemingly auspicious men in my situation of a similar genetic background were offered what seems our only road out of this repressed state apparatus. The idea is to practice tested abstinence and commit to not replicating our DNA. Religion was banished from this land years ago, yet groups still desire to cleanse other peoples from sight. The facilitators of this initiative in part get away with it by presenting to the world that they are making large scientific achievements. They show a hyperbolic scientific testing facility in all its ornamented glory. They provide statistics and other elaborate data which is all smoke and mirrors. Surely they test the intricate sexual patterns of men like me for 100 days, but in this 14-week period, men are required to go without ejaculation. How do they control our sexual activity or lack thereof? At the start of the experiment, a cybernetic mechanism that functions as a camera and information gatherer, basically a sperm-sized surveillance device, is placed in the epididymis and travels from the vas deferens to the seminiferous tubules of the testes every 6 days, sending a full statistical analysis to the lab, tracking the production levels of not only my sperm, but my testosterone. They know everything about my negative feedback control, and know if anything other than urine is passing through my urethra. Also, men under the Continence Contingency are required to journal about their experience. This is an eyewitness account of a lab rat spinning on the wheel of race extermination, not intended to offend. Why don't they just give everyone a vasectomy, you ask? Although unalienable rights have practically disappeared in the 22nd century, there are still those who uphold to dignity, and therefore even the so-called sovereignty I'm under can only get away with so much. The idea of their experiment is to teach a man to fish instead of giving him one, but in this case, teach a man not to ejaculate instead of forcing him not to, and perhaps the trend will continue, even if he is to have offspring, especially if he is to have offspring, kids with no kids, and so on. The Abstinence Authority is under the persuasion to cultivate an entire generation of men to use free birth control. It believes the technique can wipe out my entire race in a few generations. I have accepted my DNA coding will no longer exist, but I no longer care. After years of catastrophe and suffering, I just want a quiet life, even if it means I don't have a wife and kids. After 7 years of testing on 700,000 men or so in my region, reproduction rates are down 70%. Some are actually learning the ways of Methuna, male continence, and having orgasms that don't lead to emission and expulsion of semen. These men can experience orgasm within and not external to the body, but they are actually a small percentage. Sex and affection is all these people have for catharsis from their misery. This program would not stop them from having sex in any ethical sense. What isn't reported internationally is the physical torture that goes on in these programs. Those who are still masturbating to the point of expulsion are scalded, whipped, subjected to water torture and worse such things. With such incentives offered to them, it's not that these men didn't try to complete the program, but not ejaculating for 4 months isn't easy. Sometimes it would feel like sperm were slamming at my epididymis walls like fish in a tank. Let me out, let me out. But it turns out after they are inactive long enough, the body utilizes the nutrients and potential of sperm elsewhere. Still, perhaps after a 17-day stint of pure celibacy, some men would somehow find themselves in a hormonal frenzy, and by merely grazing their phallus would fall to the floor enraptured in the expelling. At which point, the urethra guard robot would send alarms to the lab room floor, and these men would be penalized, often by perverted water torture, in which the dropping water was aimed at the scrotum. So how were the reproduction estimates of my people basically nullified within a decade? Some men in the experiment simply couldn't get past the 2-week threshold without ejaculating. For many, the expulsion would happen against their will, in a dream state. These men, although against international sanctions, but kept under wraps, were forced to get a vasectomy in which the vasa deferentia are torn from the spermatic cords. But unlike regular procedures, in a disreputable version of the operation, many of us lab rats were forced upon. The ends of the deferens were not sealed, but rather left open for sperm to float around in our bloodstream. The aftermath of such horrible operations was oftentimes severe, creating powerful antibodies that led to early onslaught Alzheimer's, as well as some men going crazy when returning to their wives. Doctors performing this malicious operation would often also make an incision in the sphincter that closes off the bladder during semen expulsion, making it very painful for these men to ever ejaculate again. But hurrah, the world can rejoice because of those who made it to 100 days within 3 tries and were rewarded somewhat of a humane life. Of course, most of us would never go on to reproduce. We would call it natural castration. Some would wonder why we are forced to reduce our fecundity, our most precious gift. In the past, this was not common practice for any man. Even those who swear off masturbation as part of their religion, they were still secreting semen on occasion. I know religion doesn't exist anymore, and it is considered abhorrent to even mention it. But for what I did, I am considered a saint by some, and a sinner by others. When semen does come out, especially after long bouts of continence, it can be very milky and have a clumpy texture, at which point has a pH level of 7.5. This is important because the higher the pH level, the more ideal it is for sperm to penetrate an egg. milliliters carries around 300 to 500 million sperm. That's 300 million sperm too many according to my oppressors. And just like refugees, sperm's expelled into the ether, with the production of what it becomes in its final form, spermatozoa, which is able to even break through the cervix. That process never ceases. There's millions more being processed and millions more ready to steam out again whenever triggered. The only thing my body makes more of is skin cells. I shudder to think about being a member of the spermatogenesis mechanism, a cybernetic watchdog or otherwise. The idea of always being ready to go is disturbing. I'd like to settle down, but it would mean so much meiosis. If only I could transfer all the energy in that mode of production to keeping my heart stronger, or my knees working longer. But no, of course not. The primary reason for life is to procreate, so that part of my body will be adamant, indefinitely. Even those that do have a proper vasectomy are in effect snapping the vas deferens, which serve as an elevator from the scrotum to an eternal return, an abyss. But this does not stop sperm production. Absurd. Though I'm one of the first 100 people to complete the program, I knew a few men who had finished the 100-day Continence Contingence before me and said it changed their lives. They told me that after nearly 4 months of not releasing, when they finally came again,
they had a spiritual experience, or what we call the volcanic feeling.
Such discussion is not allowed in the upper echelons where I now live. Although I completed the program, it was no bed of roses. I broke rule number 3 of the Abstinence Authority Rulebook, which states no private or public sessions with replicant or ladies, which are cyborg prostitutes that 88% of the population hires on a weekly basis. The men of the oppressing class use these as housekeepers to their underpants. At the time, I was interested in their mechanical construction and was living with one. I have to admit that during my initiative I broke rule number 3 with her twice. The first time on my 34th day, and the second on my 65th. Because of the stimulation my fembot friend offered me, I was subjected to the aforementioned torture. I would never have sex with a human again. No wonder I made it to the 100th day on my 3rd attempt. Now that I have civil rights and can afford the materials, I have designed and manufactured some of the region's most popular replicanters. What makes them so popular? Believe it or not, although it is subtle, they very much look like the women of my race. That is to say, the people of the ruling government are secretly extremely sexually attracted to people unlike them. Biologically speaking, offspring are strengthened in such situations. It is good to come from a broad gene pool, but they ignore this. So much so, they have to hire a virtual representation of a distant and dying race to have sex with. When I give lectures about my experiences around the world, people always ask me why I would want to seize one of the greatest forms of affection that human life offers. I'll respond with a good old Uncle Aldous Huxley quote: "You cling, you crave, you assert yourself, and you live in a homemade hell. You become detached, and you live in peace." I tell them, when you separate yourself from sex, you become acutely aware of how sex runs life, and outraged by living in a sex-fueled society amidst sexual repression. Sure, we have virtual girls. We also have eugenic experiments. This isn't a religious conflict. It's not even secular. It's simply scientific. They are developing means to keep humans on the planet who have the best chance of surviving. At least the humans they think are most suitable to do so. Survival of the most reproductive. And they don't think people like me fit the bill. We see infanticide in non-human primates. This is a preemptive measure to that. Why do mountain gorillas kill infants of their own species? Simply because they aren't their own infants. They can tell they aren't the fathers, in which case, goodbye little one, they want the species to continue only if the species is inherent to their own powerful specimen. In the human kingdom, these contradictions destroy the very fabric of well-being, progress, development, but it didn't reach this point of inhumanity until the state became a military-industrial complex. The Supreme Court was eradicated, and a dictator with eugenics as a priority came into power. But I always grew up learning that the only way to change something is within the system, or at least working with someone within the system.
So, I befriended Fausto Farinell.
I'm Fausto Farinell, and I live in opulent Odelia land. I spent my early 20s frequenting symposiums that often ended up becoming all-night parties in which orgies with humans and replicanters ensued. I was known as the Alcibiades of the parties, stately, good-looking, and always up for the last round of drug, drink, pun, fun, and questioning everything and nothing, not to mention love-making. Despite my scholarly affinities and affection for excesses, I am known by most as a general in the Dumeria army, and often receive pleas, death mail, resolution schemes, and all sorts of letters from the resistance and those living in the disputed areas. The areas that my DNA has fought over for 70 years. But as many of these objectors that I've been instructed to dispose of and continue to protect against, I've always had a soft spot for the smarter activators amongst them. When I turned 32, the age my great hero Alexander the Great died, I became privy to the abstinent authority. One rather radical irredentist named Dranath Anth was actually granted citizenship, and his letter came to me from in office. This was curious in itself, but what he had to say really piqued my interest. Despite his genetic identity being decimated for a sense of freedom and liberty, he explained how he found ecstasy in the agony of repressing liquid expulsion from his sexual instrument. How outrageous it all seemed! The very foundation of my area is built around the preservation of our building blocks of life, our unique set of genetic coding. To spawn more in image and to replicate ourselves in mass quantities is therefore paramount to our culture. It is widely believed that our genetics are superior, and therefore having ample offspring is highly encouraged. It's our chromosomes that matter. The government even offers families of 5 or more children free housing. 7 includes no taxes and free education for the whole family. Similar such incentives are offered to those of the lower DNA brackets, but in that case, to cease reproduction of their inferior code. Yes, such incentives are internationally approved and do not qualify for genocide under Resolution 424, established in the year 2141. If only the International Negotiations Committee would accept that we see things like genocide in non-human primates and change the law altogether, things might be different. For example, agitated clans of male chimpanzees will kill off males of other colonies. If we only evolved from a gentler species like bonobos, perhaps there would be less conflict in the world. But here and now, many of the soldiers, even in my own troop, like to see the men they have colonized tortured. The men, shall we say, of other colonies. By believing they are less than human, they can commit atrocities to other human-like specimens. Other than the odd conscientious objector amongst us, people like Dranath are hardly considered human to Dumeria DNA. But I see him for who he really is, and wouldn't want anything bad to happen to Dranath, who after explaining to me the philosophy of the abstinence authority, became a friend. Despite my government position and the fact that I was still due my first heir, I decided to run the experiment on myself, without the use of a sphincter spine. So, I joined a clandestine fraction of abstinent partakers under the umbrella of the abstinence authority. I wore their clothing to enter meetings, and even read their handbook, went so far as to keep it in my home, probably something I could have been exiled for. Although I am against overpopulation, there's nothing I am against more than repression of sexual human rights. I believe every individual should have sexual liberty, choice between genders, their own right to change sexes, effective and safe contraceptives at their disposal, and to express themselves sexually however they please, as long as there is mutual consent and age-appropriate measures. To be frank, this occupation haunts me. I couldn't dare bring another baby into this world, to live in a world of privilege and so-called freedom, but only if they force their neighbors into mere cattle. A child that will have to ignore the hardships across the fence, and to even kill when required of it. So I decided to try their ways of celibacy, pure celibacy. They have meetings and rules, and everything you'd expect from a masturbation resistance group. One of the rules is that when you fail to ejaculate, even if you get to day 99, you have to take a cold shower. I live in a colder climate, and it's pretty much always too chilly for that. I felt I had enough inspiration for cold showers or not. When I'd come, some after the rest, I'd come a lot. For the first few months in their program, I couldn't get past 2 weeks without coming. There were so many distractions, so many opportunities for me to ejaculate. All I think about is sex. And any sexual cue gets me going. Looking at her dancing, looking at her looking at the screen, looking at his teeth on the swing, looking at his silky arms, looking at his broad shoulders. Sitting next to a larger man after a month or so of coitus never, I will look at him differently. Even look at what kind of underpants he is wearing. I'll read the brand, and look even closer at his crack. Imagine my hands on his ass. He's not even my type. Types go out the window. But then I started learning through the abstinence authority the ways of tantra and healthy continence. Many of those in the army like drag shows, and because of my long flowing hair and chiseled jaw, I used to be a revered drag queen. I always had a ball walking the floor, winning trophies, everyone wanting to know me. Although I have no problem appearing feminine and androgynous, I find the exercise in vanity irresponsible, how time-consuming it is, and counter-progressive to my new goals as a tantric healer. And what is tantra? Sex without purpose? Wrong. The most purposeful sex. A sex without interruptus. Meaning, the man will not expel, and then enter refractory period, starting sex again tired and encumbered, but rather a single continuous cycle, the most formative unity of two human beings, together as one within each other's very essence, and without the risk of reproduction. When it comes to relations with men, I never understood the appeal of an outliner-sized member. Why do I need you to rupture my asshole and tear it apart even more than this act requires? Doing so increases blood transfusion and therefore increases my chances of contracting HIV. You'd think that we would have found a cure by now in the 22nd century. Is it really all thanks to humans eating chimps in Africa eons ago? What's to learn? Don't eat cousins of your evolutionary descendants? But I know what it's like to get hungry. Really hungry. Is HIV and the virus that it becomes, acquired immune deficiency system, a conspiracy against homosexual men? There is no judgment. I enjoy a cock enveloping my behind once in a while. Let's not forget there are over 250 species that exhibit homosexual activity. There is only one species that is homophobic. Does that make me less than human? Who is to say that animals are less than human anyway? Anyway, back to the baddie boy of my fancy joy. Is the male G-spot really up the butt? Well, just like the controversy over the female G-spot, it differs with every individual and the morphology of their special zone. So, what happens when my G-spot is triggered? Pleasure and pain. It feels good while reminding me of when I was abducted as a child by a nanny who loved playing with my butthole. Tools were involved. I was just a helpless baby under duress by a deranged au pair. No wonder the only way I would fall asleep as a little one was if my mom would play the original score of The Phantom of the Opera. Inevitably, Depeche Mode's Black Celebration and Scott Walker's Bish Bosh would become my favorite albums as an adult. But anyway, back to the laws of nature and desire. Spot my better judgment reinforcing my rationality. I can't stop staring at this person who I would normally find abysmally unattractive. Only after just 14 days of my many 100-day pure celibacy tests, even he or she would appeal to me. And sometimes around 3 weeks my senses were heightened more. I would notice every blemish on someone's neck, the contours of their ears, the way their hair drops out of its bun, the bad tattoo on their leg. Every meticulous detail I would observe and be attracted by, massively. not to mention fragrances, both the horrendous stench of the sweaty body odor of a nasty boy, or the divinity of a dainty girl, engaged my sex drive. My new curious eye wouldn't seek it, but rather be forced in arousal by just about anything. Now I can laugh thinking about how absurd this delusional attraction mechanism is. My body will do anything to convince me to reproduce. I want nothing to do with an individual, yet my body will tell me they are sexy. What a rouse! Maybe I want to have sex with this person, but I don't need to. Animals behave in order to maximize the numbers of copies of genes they leave in the next generation. But is sex more than just the passage of genetic coding? DNA-innate, the way it's going, wars will see us as humans go extinct. No race any more superior or inferior to the next. Sustaining life is all that matters.